few months ago, I was book shopping, as I do, and I was picking up the books and looking through them and reading the back, as I do. I was looking in the manga section, gotten really into manga at the moment, and what did I find? Well, whilst I was perusing these shelves, real published Omegaverse, right there. Yeah. Welcome back, or welcome to my channel. My name is Ren. I make videos a couple times a week about books and pop culture, and today we are going to do a deep dive into one of fanfiction's most popular tropes, Omegaverse. If you don't know what Omegaverse is, let me enlighten you. The year 2005, date September 13th, which is Bella Swan's birthday, so just a doomed day all around. TV show Supernatural has aired for the first time, starring Jason Eccles, Dean from Gilmore Girls, and Danny Duquette. The show focuses on two brothers who hunt the supernatural. Spanning 15 seasons, an incredibly dedicated fan base, Omegaverse, as we know it today, was born. But there has been similar works with some Omegaverse tropes in. There's been Star Trek fan works with the words heat used in it, and there's other ways that people have written men getting pregnant in fan fiction since the 80s, which is a whole can of worms that we'll get into later. But the alpha, beta, omega tropes and Omegaverse that we know today, we have Supernatural to thank for that. So ABO stands for Alpha, Beta and Omega, like I just explained. In Omegaverse, the individual has two sexes. They have the male or female sex, which is determined by their external sexual organs. But then they have a secondary gender, which is Alpha, Beta or Omega, and this is determined by their internal reproductive system. Are you with me so far? It's okay if not. So following this, male Omegas can actually get pregnant. They have internal reproductive organs. In real life, is similar to what a lot of cisgendered women have. As well as this secondary gender, there's a lot of animalistic behaviour. We have knotting, yes, like what animals do, scent marking, imprinting, breeding, pack cultures, and mating. And it does come under a fantasy genre because of all of this, because obviously this is something which does not exist in real life. Alphas are dominant, usually quite physically built, short-tempered. They're the leader of the pack. Betas are the closest thing to a regular human. They have a mixture of different traits. Omegas are usually maternal, submissive, gentle. As of making this video, there is around 190,000 Omegaverse fics on AO3. That's just AO3. I'm not counting fanfic.net. I'm not counting anything on Tumblr. I'm not counting Wattpad. This is just AO3. That is almost 190,000 Omegaverse fanfic. One of the most popular fandoms of this is BTS, which again, we'll get into that later, and the conversations between real person fanfiction. So I feel like maybe let's just not write things like this about real people that exist. That is basically the whistle-stop tour of Omegaverse. You have these secondary sexes that impact your personality traits and the way that you behave. That is something which is pretty consistent among all fanfics. There might be a few where someone's an alpha and they don't normally look like an alpha, and also goes with omega, but those tend to be few and far between. It is usually pretty stereotypical who in the pairing is which secondary gender. That kind of goes into the controversy that surrounds Omegaverse, in that it is based on incredibly stereotypical systems. There are a huge amount of stereotypes when it comes to Omegaverse. You can usually tell who's going to be which because the entire system is based upon these stereotypes, and because these stereotypes are kind of woven into the foundations of Omegaverse. It is an incredibly patriarchal system. Omegas are seen as more feminine, maternal, weaker, whereas alphas are big, strong men, and it is based on that. So it is a very patriarchal system in which alphas usually are the ones in charge. They are the top dog, and I mean literally things. So there's a lot of dubious consent and sexual assault is huge within Omegaverse. Even in the published works that I saw in the bookshop, even from the blurb, even just flicking through, it was obvious. And Omegaverse fanfiction is rife with it. There is basically this entire thing where if an Omega goes into heat, all of the alphas are just kind of like mine, and it kind of acts as if it's like fair game for anyone to just do what they want. And that's kind of scary. That's like a massive trope within these systems, and it's not even done in like we'll highlight the issues here. It's done in a fetishizing way, and I think that's where a lot of the problem comes into Omegaverse, is that it is huge, like hugely based on fetish. Theory, there isn't anything wrong with Omegaverse. It's fantasy trope that people want to read about, and people read about loads of different things. People have different interests and different kinks, and they're interested in different elements of these systems. And it is interesting. I mean, when I first found out about it, I was like, I kind of want to read this and figure out what this is and what kind of falls into it. But I think the dubious consent kind of elements, it really puts me off, and I just find it like it's a bit uncomfortable. That's kind of where a lot of the controversy comes in, is that the way that it is portrayed, it is very rarely portrayed as a bad thing. And it's interesting to me as well, because a lot of these tropes are falling into other books as well. Even if we go all the way back to Twilight, imprinting is in Twilight, Jacob imprinting on Renesmee, and the rest of the walls imprinting on different people. Knotting is in a lot of very smutty fantasy books, and books involving werewolves. You know, even the most recent Bride by Ali Hazelwood has different Omegaverse tropes in it. That's very obvious. Omegaverse in its entirety, like male, like MPreg stuff, everything, it's usually kept online. Like, I don't see a lot of that out in public, so it kind of really took me off guard when I saw this. It was surprising that you can see it like just on the shelf. The other part of like controversy that comes in when it comes to Omegaverse is the Omegaverse litigation lawsuit, in which Addison Kane, who is an author, she started writing fanfic. It was erotic Dark Knight fanfic, and then, like a lot of fanfiction authors, they decide to pull the works and then revise it to turn it into an original works. Addison Kane published the Alpha Claim series. Zoe Ellis was another author who also wrote romantic erotic fanfiction with Omegaverse tropes. Addison Kane actually followed a takedown notice to Zoe Ellis for alleged plagiarism of the Alpha's Claim series, and even sent the takedown notices to retailers who removed some of Zoe Ellis's books. Zoe then filed some lawsuits back alleging abuse of the takedown notices, and it was a whole thing. I think that the case is now closed, but it's still a huge topic of conversation when it comes to Omegaverse fanfic communities online, because there's this whole conversation of like, if something like this is originated on fanfic, who does it actually belong to? The person that started writing this first within supernatural fanfic is gonna really struggle when it comes to copyright, because they're not going to be able to copyright anything that has supernatural characters in it, because they don't own them. They don't have the rights to supernatural, therefore they cannot copyright claim something they've written involving supernatural. So kind of these tropes, it opens up this wider discussion of using these to benefit from and to profit from. Are we allowed to do that when it comes to these tropes, where kind of it's hard to find out where it originated, as in like the person it originated from, who does it belong to? And I guess these copyrights kind of fell into that, because it's like, whose idea was this? Whose is it that we can use these ideas and put them in published novels, when it's usually something which stays online in communities where no profit is made? I think that that's like a really interesting conversation, because there's a lot of things that originate in fanfic and a lot of different tropes, and you see it more and more in different books now. There's a lot of fanfic tropes. These tropes work in fanfiction when used, because the world building is already there. You do not need to add to world building when someone already knows these characters. But you can just like keep the world that already exists and people know. That same thing doesn't work in fiction books, because you have to add the world building as well. Therefore, a lot of these tropes kind of occasionally fall short because of that. It's genuinely crazy to me that this type of writing isn't just limited to fanfiction spaces anymore, and I'm not one that like wants to stop things from becoming popular, but maybe this time we should have kept Omegaverse in the vault. I do genuinely feel baffled that I can just go into my local bookshop and pick it up off the shelf in its entirety with all of these different elements in it. That's crazy to me. Another huge topic of conversation when it comes to Omegaverse and controversy surrounding it is, why did a system when men can get pregnant have to be built when trans men can get pregnant? Editing me, I just want to add, I don't know if I've fully made myself clear at this point, but when I said about trans men having children, obviously not all trans men can have children, not all trans men want to have children, and not all trans men want to have children in that way. They don't want to be pregnant. But the conversation is just that there were a lot of trans men being like, we exist and a lot of us do have children, so why have you made this odd stereotype when we're right here? Kind of erases this entire group of people in the population that are able to have children, and a lot of them do want children. But what we've done is created a community where there's a lot of dubious consent, where these characters are very submissive, where it's become a bit like a fetish rather than like an actual, I want to have a child to have a family, and that's something my body can do. It becomes this kind of fetishy thing. And I have seen a lot of trans men online talking about this, and it was something that I hadn't necessarily thought of until I saw these conversations. And I've been like deep diving into a lot of different conversations surrounding Omegaverse, kind of the controversy surrounding it and why it can have problematic elements. I also want to talk about the fact how a lot of Omegaverse, and I think, and like you see it a lot in other tropes as well, but it is rife among Omegaverse, is that real people are being written about here. And I feel like, particularly with this trope, that's not okay, like more than a lot of the other tropes. Real person fanfic exists. I'm not going to pretend like I am a complete saint of this world and have never read it. When I was a teenager and didn't fully understand the problematic nature of real person fanfic, I read a couple. Now I'm older, I'm realizing that's very, it's very strange, and I wouldn't want to do that, and it can feel like a huge breach of privacy. I know some people say they don't mind it, but it's this huge thing where you're kind of putting a lot onto real people, and you are kind of, especially when it's something like this, like BTS is one of the most popular fandoms in which Omegaverse exists, and they are all real people, and you are making decisions for them within that. You are making sexuality decisions, you're stereotyping them, you're putting them in these certain boxes, and it becomes this sort of unhealthy cycle, like you're kind of making these decisions for them and categorizing who you think they are, whereas they're actually real people. It's very publicly fetishizing real people and putting them into these different boxes that have these different meanings, and it is almost like 99.9999% of the time it is sexual. There is sexual elements to Omegaverse. I don't think I've actually ever seen an Omegaverse where there was no mention or no acknowledgement or even no sex scenes. Like, it's always there. It is integrated in the bones of Omegaverse. It comes from a sexual place. That's where all of these tropes come from. So I think that by doing that with real people, I don't think we should be writing real people fanfic anyway, but by doing things like this and involving real people, there's a lot of things raised there on whether or not this is actually, a good thing to do when it comes to real people. Characters, there's no harm, there's no harm done. If that's what you want to read about with characters, no, absolutely knock yourself out. I'm not shaming at all. If that's what you want to read, that's what you want to read. Just find the whole thing fascinating. I find how much the trope has grown fascinating. I find it fascinating that it's now in published works, that people genuinely buy it and want to read it, and that it's there, and it's in not even just novels, it's in manga, and you can it is very quite graphic. It really just interesting, because I think of all the tropes that have originated online, this one is one of the biggest ones. I don't think you can argue with that. You know, enemies to lovers, friends to lovers, that kind of thing, misunderstanding. Those have been tropes in other books for so long. You know, they didn't originate online, but to see something which originated on a fan fiction site now be one of the most popular tropes and now be in actual books that you can publish. Now, there are people on TikTok who have basically created their entire following explaining Omegaverse, which I find fascinating. There are so many facets to this. Basically, the internet has created this entire trope that now has so much to it. There are, you know, sub genres within it, there are different rules within it, there's different elements to it, and I just find it really, really, really fascinating that the internet has done this, that this trope came from the internet, that this is something which has been explored in just fan works until it started being published in other books. I just find it really, really interesting that that's the case, and I don't know of any other tropes that have had such a reach as this one does, which I think in itself is very impressive. But I also think that because it's so popular and because it's becoming more and more popular, because it's in very popular books and books that are going viral, it is really important to talk about the controversy surrounding it and to talk about the stereotypes within it and the systems within it and the impact that they can have, kind of the attitudes within it, and like the lawsuits and questioning who does it actually belong to, who could potentially have the original rights, and then the fact that it's in other books, is it copyright infringement every time because it's in lots of other books and there's different elements of it within multiple books. And I think that the controversy is also really interesting because I think that whilst yes, what people read is their business and I'm not here to judge, because you read what you want to read, absolutely knock yourself out, but I think that it's interesting to think about that controversy and to think about the impact that it is having. I find it such an interesting trope, and I find it such an interesting thing to talk about as well, because it's always interesting to get other people's opinions and which parts of it they're like, no, and which parts of it they find interesting. So I would love to know everyone's thoughts on Omegaverse, the controversial parts, the reach that it's had, the impact in current publishing, and what you think about it in general, because I genuinely, like this, like I said, this video is not to shame anyone, it's not to be on here and be like Omegaverse is shit, because everyone reads what they want to read, and that is up to them, and as long as no one is actually being harmed, then off you go. But I do think it's an interesting conversation to have because I don't see it kind of being spoken about a lot. So I want to talk about it. Share your views, share your opinions, share your thoughts, all in the comments. On other social media, which will also be in the description as well. Thank you for watching this video. Like I said, my name is Ren. I make videos a couple of times a week about books and pop culture. Thank you for watching. I hope you're doing really, 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 really well. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.